Thank you very much, everybody. We are going to have a great webinar tonight, and I appreciate everyone attending. First, I would like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this land and waterways in the region for thousands of years and many generations. I pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I look forward to our shared future together. I invite everyone on the call to think about the custodial ancestors of the lands they are on, wherever you may be. So today we're going to be talking about media matters, how reporting shapes a modern pandemic. This is presented by the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, one of the world's leading institutions of public health research and education. The Global Health Alliance, which is an alliance of Australian organizations advancing health equity and health security through sustainable development in our region, as well as the Melbourne Population and Global Health Student Society, a community network for public health students, alumni, and staff of University of Melbourne that aims to provide a platform that enables networks to be formed and strengthened beyond the classroom. In terms of housekeeping, a few things. It's best if you use gallery view in terms of your viewing experience. The chat has been disabled, but please use the question and answer function to post any questions that you have. We will be having a segment where we take questions from the audience at the end of the webinar. So January 19th, 2020. That was the date the first patient with COVID-19 arrived on Australia's shores. 435 days later, our world looks entirely different. And part of how that world has been shaped has been through the media. As always, the events of our days are filtered through journalists and the news, but never in my lifetime has the need for news and information been more urgent over a very extended period of time. This is posed many challenges for journalists in terms of balancing the need to provide information, but also the need to investigate and to do their job as journalists. We've seen the impact of a very polarized media in the United States and other jurisdictions. The media in other places has actively caused deaths by misinformation and by making actual management of the pandemic a political thing. So obviously the media has been very important in terms of the course of the pandemic. And so we thought that we'd bring together some journalists and an epidemiologist, not an armchair version, the real version, to reflect on how reporting in the media has informed, influenced, and shaped our understanding of the pandemic and our pandemic response. So tonight we have 4 panelists: Tony Blakely, Chip Legrand, Virginia Trioli, and David Waugh. And I'd like to introduce them. Each will kind of just say a few words with their overall thoughts, and then we'll hear from them in a panel with questions and answers. So first, David Waugh is the Director of Audio and Language Content for SBS. He has over 20 years experience in the media industry and has led a number of senior executive roles at the ABC. He's been responsible for diverse portfolios across content, marketing, commercial, radio, and digital. Prior to coming to SBS, he led the ABC's international services, including Radio Australia, ABC Australia TV, and digital services that connect audiences around the world with Australian stories. Born overseas, David has lived in regional New South Wales before moving to Sydney and speaks multiple languages, but he says struggles to find the right words more often than he'd like and writes extensively on the back of his hand. David?
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks for Melbourne University for organising this panel. I have been in the media for a long period of time, been with SBS for a shorter period of time, but very, very proud to be part of the organisation, and particularly because when I think about where SBS as an organisation actually started 45 years ago, it was actually as a 3-month radio licence to help with the rollout of Medibank and Medicare, just to help with linguistically diverse members of the community understand more about what that meant to their health. And it's just so important to look at the work that SBS is doing right now, particularly around the coronavirus portal, which has got content that's updated all the time, but in 60 over 60 languages, and SBS continuing the work in terms of keeping the community healthy and safe. Some of the key challenges around this time for everybody is that all the journalists are well and truly part of this story as well. People are impacted in terms of their lives, their kids, their concern for people who are elderly in their households, but also, and their families and their friendship circles, but also the narrative about what's going on overseas looms very, very large in terms of the journalists that are part of my team. And certainly in terms of things like the vaccine, very important to recognise that while we've got excellent institutions here in Australia, it's not necessarily the case in a lot of home countries and territories, in which case there is that doubt that needs to be addressed as well. So an enormous amount of work goes into being able to provide accurate, timely, reliable and balanced information in this space. But, you know, our job is very much for that multilingual, multicultural part of the community, and so important to get it right, because as with so many things COVID, we're only as good as our weakest link in this case, and it would be great. It's great to just take a humanist, global approach to our health.
Thank you. Now, next we have Virginia Trioli, a two-time Walkley Award winner. Virginia Trioli is one of Australia's best-known journalists with a formidable reputation as a television anchor, radio presenter, writer, and a commentator who combines a rigorous interviewing style with a wicked sense of humor. Virginia is an honours graduate in fine arts from the University of Melbourne and La Trobe University, and has held senior positions at the Age newspaper and the Bulletin magazine, and has been a trusted and exceptional reporter on radio and television for the ABC. Since late 2019, so very close to the start of the pandemic, she's been the host of the morning program on ABC Radio Melbourne. Virginia?
Nancy, thank you. And yes, thanks to the University of Melbourne for doing this. I feel like we're almost, it's a great point in the cycle to do it, even while, and I'm sure Chip would agree with me about this, we're still just sort of all barely kind of got our noses above water, dealing with the aftermath or the end of the pandemic, if we can say that, and then the rollout of the vaccine. And of course today, you know, learning of a 3-day lockdown in Brisbane, we're still, you know, right in the thick of it. A couple of reflections from me, and then I'm you know, keen to get into sort of the heart of the discussion itself. It was when I started on Left News Breakfast and took over from John Fain on mornings on ABC Radio Melbourne, a very different kind of job and a different sort of audience that I went to. And sitting in that chair at the very start of the pandemic was a very different thing from that much more removed experience of sitting at a desk and you know, reporting the news with, you know, some interviews, maybe a little bit of analysis, but it was a very sort of distant thing. The kind of work that you do when you're presenting the show that I do is a very intimate and very connected job. And you are there as a community of listeners, and you feel very close to those people, and they do to you. And I certainly do every single day, going through this together, and people relying on our station and our show to inform, to, you know, provide company and information, and to get it right. And that became then a very challenging thing in relation to the pandemic, because presenting the news of the day was one thing, but then it had to be presented in a way where the community of listeners would hear it and would feel okay about it. It was a very, think back to the early days, in the early days of approaching the first shutdown and panic buying and the like. It was a very jittery audience, very nervous and anxious. And you could sort of set off that anxiety with, you know, questions that were reasonable to ask, but perhaps phrased in a tone that might, you know, scare the horses. And whereas, you know, that very, you know, crisp, clipped sort of tone, you know, just doing my job, ma'am, that's what I'm here to do on News Breakfast, it wasn't necessarily appropriate in that kind of setting and in that chair, and you could upset people. And I think I was sort of initially very taken aback at how upsettable people were, and that was, you know, a challenge to me to try and get that tone right, and I think to all radio presenters actually, because you had that, you know, immediacy of their response. We were being asked detailed questions on a minute-by-minute basis. Where can I go to get that? I rang up to get tested, but there wasn't any availability. Where can I go? I'm trying to get toilet paper and baby food for my child, and my local supermarket's all shopped out. Where can I go? And these are text messages coming in on my live text message screen that I have in the studio, in addition to talkback callers that are coming in constantly. And it's quite confronting, where you think, well, I've got an interview with the Premier coming up next, but this is the other part of my job as well, is to try and get an answer to that question. And accepting, as you know, we really went into the maelstrom, that sort of, you know, mad, tightly twisting sort of tornado of those first few months of, you know, serious pandemic, as the numbers went up and up. Realizing that I don't know if I can necessarily answer all these questions in real time and do everything else that's part of this job was very confronting. And you had to sort of confront that perhaps you were, you know, failing in part of your job in not being able to do all that, not being all things to all people at once. It'll be interesting to talk about, you know, how we sourced and the news that we did, and how we assured ourselves that what we were reporting or broadcasting was, you know, fair and accurate and true. That would be good to go into. And I make that point because while we're all here talking about what we did and didn't do and how we reported this during the pandemic, in one sense, a big part of the information battle was being won in other places, and that was in social media, and in far corners of social media where, you know, our conversation probably doesn't stretch today, and where there has been an extraordinary change in how people get their information, what they believe, what they're persuaded of, the disinformation out there, and the highly sophisticated methods that various, you know, bad actors use in order to disseminate that false information. And that's a very big part of this picture. And as we lead into the vaccination now and talk about vaccine hesitation by some, and you know, outright anti-vaxxer beliefs by others, I think a discussion of, or at least an understanding of, the role that disinformation on social media has played is an important part of that.
Absolutely. And hopefully we'll have a chance to get into that. Our next panelist is Professor Tony Blakely, who's head of the Population Interventions Unit at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, University of Melbourne. Tony is an epidemiologist and public health medicine specialist. His research focuses on quantifying the impact of population interventions on health gain and health expenditure. During 2020, he led modeling of the COVID-19 policy response. He was responsible for the roadmap that was an agent-based model that demonstrated elimination was feasible. He's had a very high media profile during the pandemic, so it will be really interesting to hear Tony's take.
Thank you, Nancy. Kia ora koutou. I'm going to make a couple of reflections on my experience, and it's quite different, I think, than what most people might have had. I was a newbie here. I'd only just arrived from Kiwi land. Who's this guy? No profile, not known by anybody. But it was a distinct advantage because I wasn't on any of the committees. I wasn't gagged. The vast majority of epidemiologists at the beginning, at least of the pandemic, were, rightly speaking, so busy, head down, bum up, working on their committees and trying to provide advice, but also a little bit compromised on what they could say. And I'm just there and I'm not yet on any committees and I can speak up. So I made use of that, and I enjoy the media and I like explaining things. So the role that I took through the majority of the pandemic was to explain things. So I'd always be saying on the one hand and on the other hand. Sometimes I got known as being a little bit of a doomsayer because often on that hand wasn't that good and you had to look at the other options. For a little while, I did swing into advocacy mode because I advocated quite hard for elimination for about 3 weeks there when I thought we really needed to move that way. But most of the time I was doing an explainer role. The other thing that I'd reflect on is that I've had quite a lot of media experience in New Zealand, but nothing like this last year. But my experience with the media this year has been 99% extremely positive. I have found the media to be extremely respectful, You know, Chip and I have had many discussions, likewise with Virginia. If I say I don't know about this, they won't take me there in the questions. It's been very respectful. There's only a couple times where it's got a bit rough, and that was particularly after I put my researcher hat on and also provided modelling to the Victorian government. That got quite hot for a while, and I just pulled back from the media for a week. And also there was one situation there where one branch of the media was trying to play me off in the politics and stuff. So that got a little bit tricky. But other than that, it was pretty good. So to summarise, I think the media and academics, from my experience at least, and my discussions with other epidemiologists and other researchers who have been in this role, really has been a nice tandem experience. I think we've done it pretty well. It's not been perfect. And I think it's been a good year for academics working with the media. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Tony. And finally, we have Chip Legrand. So Chip has been a journalist for nearly 30 years and worked most of his career in Melbourne. As the Age's chief reporter, he writes about politics, crime, and sport, and anything else that makes a good story. Like nearly every other journalist in 2020, he wrote extensively about the pandemic and the Victorian government's response to the second wave of the epidemic. Chip?
Hi, everyone. And look, I'll just start with an observation, which is that really I think the pandemic, it just changed normal politics in a really significant way. And when you think about, say, the polarisation of politics at the moment, I mean, it's a decent bet that sort of 1 out of every 2 people is quite happy for the government to fall over at any given time. That's just the nature of our politics at the moment. The pandemic was really different because everyone had a shared interest in the government being successful. We all wanted good government during this thing, not just here, but in every jurisdiction. And I think how that made for an interesting dynamic, though, with the media, of course, because we're not there to cheer for the government. We're not there to amplify the government message. Our job's a little bit different from that. And if you look at, say, what happened in Western Australia with the amazing results over there, with the Liberals almost wiped off the electoral map. They just won, 2 seats in an 80-seat parliament. You've got the West Australian Premier with this extraordinary majority over there. And that was very much a reflection of the popularity of his pandemic policies, which was really just one: shut the border, and we don't have to worry about anything. And so it was a Fortress WA, and it worked very well for him. But if you talk to people over there who were involved in that campaign, they say there was almost a sort of form of Stockholm syndrome going on among the voters. They were so invested in the success of of Western Australian government. They were so invested in the Premier, who they trusted. It got to a point where almost any criticism of the Premier was seen as a criticism of Western Australia. It was almost seen as unpatriotic, which if anyone spent any time in Perth, I mean, that's an absolute death knell in terms of West Australian politics. And so it was less pronounced here because our response to the pandemic, it was more complex, and also it was less successful. But there still felt like at times that the media doing its job, which is really trying to hold decision makers and also the bureaucracy which informs that decision making to account. It was almost like any criticism was seen as somehow either undermining the public health message or almost unpatriotic, un-Victorian in its approach. And that made for a very challenging environment for journalists to do their jobs. Because as much as that social compact between, say, the electorate and the politicians had changed, our fundamental job hadn't changed. And it was really important that we kept doing it. And if you look at a lot of the things that were essential to, say, Victoria's success in overcoming the second wave and where we're at now. So the problems with our public health system, the sense of our public health systems being so centralised and under-resourced at the start of the pandemic, the problems in contact tracing, the problems with the FES database, and the lack of local knowledge to deal with these things. Now, they emerged, those problems were basically exposed by media reporting. The problems in hotel quarantine, again, were very much originated by good independent media reporting. So, I mean, I'd say that type of journalism had an absolutely essential role to play, not just in the traditional sense of keeping the government to account, but also improving Victoria's response to the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, and that's a great start to our discussion. You know, I spoke with all of you for about 30 minutes before this, and one thing that all of the journalists talked to me about was the challenge of actually living during the pandemic while you're trying to report on the pandemic, and how you essentially were within the story, and that's quite a different situation than reporters usually are in, even in disasters where you generally parachute in and you report on the situation, but you don't actually have to live there with waiting in line for toilet paper at the supermarket. So, you know, how did you deal with the challenges of remaining objective? How did that influence your reporting in terms of actually having to live in the story? Chip, do you want to take that one?
Well, look, I think it was challenging, and it was mainly just, as you say, it's trying to maintain your objectivity when the very real impacts of the pandemic are just going on in other rooms of your house. I mean, so you've got the kids at home from school, they're dealing with the normal stuff. The teenagers are cut off from their friends. The local sport is not going on. Now, these are all, you might say they're first world problems, but nonetheless, they're having an impact on them. They're having an impact on us as their parents. I mean, all our own jobs, of course, were very much changed. Virginia's probably a little bit different because you've got to go into a radio studio to broadcast a program. But this kind of, you're quite right that we were immersed in this story in a way that you really aren't if you're going somewhere to cover an earthquake or another sort of a disaster where you sort of hit the ground running and you haven't got that same sort of sensitivity. And I think that the flip side of that is it's a strength, because the thing that you're reporting on, these are the people that they're living next to. You're walking down the street, you're at the store. You're in a lot of ways your reporting is very framed not just by the experts that you're talking to and the people in government that you're talking to and so forth, but just by the people, these everyday meetings that you're having and their reflections and their experience.
David, you have an even more complex relationship to the story because your journalists are in a lot of different places and living in very different pandemics. So how did you find maintaining objectivity and balancing that or negotiating that?
Oh, well, look, everyone's, of course, a professional when it comes to these things, but in terms of the hardship that people actually experienced, many of our journalists at SBS did have to start working from home, including broadcasting radio from home, and shifted very, very quickly to be able to do that effectively while having the kids running around in the other room and trying to balance a baby under one arm and elderly parents worried about them in a nursing home in another part of their brain. Added to that, though, is the fact that there is, with our cohort of journalists, a lot of consideration for what's happening overseas, and not just from a global pandemic perspective, but from a very deeply personal perspective as well, which is to say that there are very dear friends and family who aren't safe and who have been dying and who are incredibly unwell as part of this pandemic. And I think what's most incredibly sad about all of the pandemic stories that I come across are the ones where people are in their last moments and they can't be comforted by anyone that is closest to them at that time. It's an incredible tragedy, really. So the experience of our journalists are also coloured very much by what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Africa, what is happening in many of the territories in which their audiences and themselves come from in terms of the lived experiences of people there. So yeah, very challenged environment there to be operating and to be maintaining composure, as well as, of course, your objectivity and your balance.
So reporters were living in the story, but Tony, at one point you became the story. And so that must have been uncomfortable when it became personal, when people were actually talking about you at press conferences, when you had a good pandemic, if I remember the quote. What was your response to that? What was your thinking during that time period? It must have been pretty unusual.
Yeah, for about a week there after the launch of the roadmap, it got pretty heated. quite a lot of hate mail, all that sort of stuff. You just ignore that. Part of it was just to retreat from the media for 3 or 4 days, but boy, oh boy, after 4 days was I championed to get back in it because I wanted to correct the record. So for a while there, yes, I was part of the story. People like Nicole Shavstick on the regional ABC radio in Victoria, we had several interviews where we talked about that quite candidly, and that was actually quite therapeutic in a way, talking about that. But I want to come back, if that's okay, Nancy, to talk about Chip's point about the investigative journalism, and then Virginia's point about the soothing journalist, if you like. So Chip mentioned the need for the media to keep digging in a respectful way, and I completely agree. The number of discussions I had with journalists, which comes back to your point, Nancy, where I'd say, you really should ask the Premier that question in the press conference, and then 5 minutes later, it was happening. So I was in part letting go my role completely as an epidemiologist and trying to help the journalists to dig a bit deeper, and particularly with contact tracing, which, boy, was that hot. Because for me, our models had contact tracing in them. And if I was saying too much that was critical of the contact tracing, I was sort of essentially criticizing our own model, but I knew that there was more going on than what was there. And to just keep digging there and bringing the truth out was mission critical, that people like Chip did. And Trioli mentioned the comforting reporter, if I can summarize that way. That also came to me, because I tend to call things quite black and white, you know, And I had a very senior colleague, you'll know this person, Nancy, who said to me, Tony, we need to keep the public spirits up as well. And so I had to learn to sometimes try and finish optimistically and positively so as not to just talk about the bad stuff. I actually found that quite difficult because I didn't want to be false and trying to induce hope when there was a problem happening. And I found that quite challenging. So I resonate with what Virginia was saying about that challenge of calling it down the line versus trying to keep everybody G'd up and going forward. I found that quite challenging.
Yeah, no, it was a very difficult balance. But I think back to your point about journalists asking questions. We asked for questions from the audience to be submitted beforehand, and the questions ranged from people wondering why reporters quote savaged Dan Andrews to other questions asking whether reporters should have taken a harder line in questioning. So it's a bit of a Goldilocks situation. So either too hard, too soft. Virginia, did you get it just right? Did you get in the medium soft bed? What do you think? I mean, you talked to me about the need to ask ugly questions.
Yeah.
And, I think that's an important point to talk about.
That has always been and will always be the job of a journalist. And Chip, alluded to that directly. It's an extraordinary privilege that we have to be able to pick up the phone, call anyone and ask the most impertinent questions. And it sounds blunt and rough when you see it in action, and it often is. And that's why a live interview, say, with me and Tony on air, can get a bit willing, because I am pressing to try and get around the obfuscation or the I can't be mean to the government, cushioning that Tony has understandably built into his answers, or the we're not quite prepared to yet release that information, dodging that he's built into the other side of the answer, and I have to just be uncaring about any of that, and just keep trying to get him to answer that question. Ditto the Premier, ditto the Health Minister. They are ugly questions, and I think what the pandemic brought about, and I echo Chip's view that it was seen by so many as fundamentally disloyal to ask tough questions in those circumstances. It was absolutely the job, but what I think was pointed out was maybe I won't say a lack of media literacy, because I think there is a real understanding that actually is our job. We're there to speak truth to power, to call out the BS, and to try and get to the heart of the matter. But I do think there has been an absolutely understandable mistrust that has been built into and really driven into the population here in Australia by, I would argue, a number of media outlets and a number of high-profile media commentators in particular, and broadcasters who have made it their job to foment anxiety and mistrust of institutions, of governments, of doctors, of scientists, of teachers, of judges, all those key democratic institutions in our country. And I think you're seeing the payoff now. And the payoff is in that skepticism or just outright hostility to you doing your job, that they don't trust you and they don't believe you. I think we need to also bring in here what's happening in the background, a very loud background in terms of the social media. Misinformation that's been punched out there as well, that's sort of creating that atmosphere of mistrust. So it makes asking the hard, straight, ugly question and insisting on an answer really tricky now, because we were not there to be the cheerleaders of the government's response, even while, of course, Chip is right, everyone wanted to see each state survive, the country survive, us get through this well. We weren't there to be the cheerleaders, but at the same time, and particularly any responsible media outlet had this difficult line to walk as well, which is no one wanted to, for trivial reasons or just out of pure folly, undermine the public health response. So walking that line between not just sort of willfully undermining a public health response, basically, shouting fire in a crowded theatre, to use the old trope, but at the same time, calling those in charge to account was probably the finest line that any of us have ever walked.
Nancy, can I address that question of the press conference in particular too? Because I think this is a fascinating thing. What we saw, a lot of people.
The ugly question there at the press conference.
Yeah. Look, like the interface between most people and their experience of the meeting during the pandemic was the Dan Andrews press conference. It was like appointment press conference every day, right? For an hour, he stood up but from our point of view, from a reporter's point of view, this wasn't the Premier spending as long as necessary to answer all our questions, to provide all the information. If you think back to when those press conferences started, these really long ones, the ones that, went for the limitless, it happened pretty much when the genomics report landed. And when it was clear that the second wave epidemic was linked to hotel quarantine, to failures in hotel quarantine. This wasn't the Premier trying to inform us. This was the Premier trying to control the damage, right? Which he needs to do. Any politician needs to do that when they're in a tight spot. And really, it almost became an hour-long filibuster where the Premier would spend an inordinate amount of time not answering questions. People out there got very frustrated at journalists who kept asking the same question, but it was because they weren't getting a straight answer. And sometimes you just have to keep hammering, and it sounds tedious, and it is for kind of everyone involved, but equally it is still part of the job. The flip side of that is that particularly print journalists, I mean, Virginia's done a lot of her interviewing through her career on air. So the questions, the answers, everything's broadcast, the reaction is everything filmed. So she has an acute understanding that the question can be as an important part of the interview as an answer. For print journalists, we're not really used to that. We're not used to people listening into our questions. We're not used to people caring about our questions. Normally for a print journalist, all that matters is the answer. That's what we're there for. This kind of flipped that around. So it became on this performative piece and it was very funny to sort of watch it with, you had this sort of Facebook feed going on and all the punters at home are sort of giving critiques of the journalists that they particularly hate and so forth as it's going on. And it was really quite strange. It was a bit of an out-of-body experience actually to see this kind of a fairly mundane aspect of journalism through the eyes of people who aren't used to watching it. So I think for everyone, it was a really different experience. Look,
it's really true. And you could see people were horrified, just horrified to see that that's how they're elected leaders. And for many people, as Chip said, 1 in 2, possibly Victoria a little higher, I think, at the moment, if you look at the polls.
Yeah, 3 maybe.
But for several in 5, this was just the grossest impertinence. To be so disrespectful, to be so blunt, to be so repetitive, to be so insistent with someone like Daniel Andrews, who, for goodness sake, was just trying to do his job. And I'm so sorry. I apologise to everyone who's watching on this webinar today, who to this day feels that we were impertinent, and Chip and I will just have to take that to our grave and have it, on our stone. But that is the damn job.
Yeah, I mean, at some points it became like a Greek tragedy in terms of the chorus asking the same questions over and over again. But then at the end of the day, you have to ask, why was there never an answer about who approved the security? David, we had some comments about social media, and you had a very interesting perspective where your audience has a very different view of government-sponsored media versus social media. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure, thanks, Nancy. In relation to the domain around social media and misinformation that exists in that space, really interesting to be aware that many of the audiences that we serve and many of the audiences within the Australian community who speak a language other than English come from places where their trust in traditional media is less than their trust in social media. And that is to say that many places around the world where you've got traditional media, that it's state broadcasting or media with very, very clear commercial or other imperatives that are driving the agenda. So when it comes to being in an Australian context, that plays out in some very interesting ways, of course, because not only for the audience, they're trying to sort out what to believe in social media, but also for an organisation like SBS, which is largely government funded. Our job is not only to convey to our audiences that we are an independent, balanced and trusted voice, but to also explain to audiences that the funding model, which is, yes, we get money from taxpayers through the government, does not make us automatically, and far from it, does not make us automatically a state broadcaster and a mouthpiece of government. And I think that that's the same challenge that I had when working at the ABC around explaining that to people too. So you've got this situation where essentially many of our core audiences are engaged on social media platforms. They are coming across, and it doesn't ever fail to surprise or disappoint me just how low the bar of misinformation can be, or what's fake can be before it's actually shared as well. But they're operating in that space where there's an enormous amount of misinformation. How does SBS or the ABC or Fairfax or other trusted media organisations challenge that by operating effectively in that space, and to remedy some of the misinformation that's going on in that space is something that we've been very, very focused on. What we find happens a lot is that we will have on social media members of the audience actually inboxing us and asking us, well, is this real or is it actually not real? And then that's a great mechanism for us to follow up in terms of our storytelling and what's priorities, what's of interest to the audience, and then playing that back to them, fact-checked. Yeah.
So one of the other things you talked to me about was how you never wanted to have to contradict your former self. And Tony, this is for you because, you know, we were dealing with a totally new disease. So, you know, there were a few 180s along the way, and some of it wasn't just social media giving misinformation. You know, all of the experts, including myself, gave some misinformation at some point because we just didn't understand the disease. So what did you get wrong, and how did you try to seek forgiveness for your errors, I guess, shall we say, or repair any damage done?
Well, one of our colleagues took great delight in the first time she saw me just before Christmas and saying, Tony, you advocated for elimination, but right at the beginning, you talked about how we could ride this out. And so it wasn't so much wrong, but, you know, we were thinking right at the beginning.
That was pretty wrong, Tony.
Well, I was just explaining the options, saying, well, we could ride it out, or we could go real low, or we could go for elimination, because we were talking about squashing the sombrero, Boris's language. And I was talking about, yeah, we let it there and we just hold it there. And then a few days later, I started doing some of my, not the super models, just my really basic Excel models. And boy, oh boy, was it hard to keep it there. I just keep doing this. And I started realizing, oh, this doesn't look very good. So that would be my it's not really a mea culpa, but my sort of realization that I probably talked a little bit too long about the viability of that sort of approach.
Well, I had an absolute ripper along those lines right at the beginning, because it's been so instructive to me. And I think all of us as a community should take instruction from this and from the experience. David knows this better than me. So David, I'm not teaching you how to suck eggs. The experience of, Southeast Asian countries around us, our peer nations here in this region, who, as I understand, actually from a public health perspective, are not considered our peer nations. Actually, we look to the UK and the US. But what did Australian Asians do here in Melbourne? They immediately put on masks. They socially distanced. They left the supermarkets. They left the shopping centres. A number of them stayed home. We had stories on this. And then we had leading community members from the Chinese Australian Melbourne community on the program saying, for goodness sake, take your masks off. They're not necessary. The World Health Organization says they're not necessary. You're scaring people. You're freaking everyone out. Come out of your homes. And I was sort of part of doing those interviews, and it was absolutely 100% wrong. And I had a woman ring in on Talkback from who had lived in Singapore during SARS, I think it was, and who said, Virginia, we won't. We're not taking our masks off, and we're not coming back out, and we know about this, and sorry, it won't happen. And she was just the most, wonderfully thoughtful, intelligent woman, who worked at some bank in Collins Street, and she said, nah. And basically she was saying, you guys have got it wrong, and we'll set our watch and we'll wait until you catch up. And that's exactly what happened. And I think I've said on air close to 150 times, I was wrong. I'm sorry about that. And I want to issue an apology, to Asian Australians here in Melbourne who absolutely got it right. And I have a general question, which is maybe for a seminar for another time, Tony, about why we don't pay closer attention and why we didn't pay closer attention to that lived experience of those nations that went through SARS, MERS, H1N1, swine flu, the whole thing.
Well, we do in the professional circles, because we did know that those countries near China, they learned from SARS-1. So Taiwan did exceptionally well. Yep. But still, I'm a public health medicine specialist, and we're part of the Australian faculty, which is associated with the UK faculty.
That's right.
And that's kind of where we naturally read the BMJ. So there is a bit of that sort of network stuff going on, but I do think we have learned.
But more than, I want to jump in there, more than network stuff, and this is an interesting part of that of media coverage as well, is that, and I know that I'm sure that Chip had this experience too, because of social media, we were being informed in real time by all sorts of really interesting, connected, informed healthcare workers, people who worked in research in other places, who were credentialed and authoritative as well, who were behind the scenes informing us and saying, no, that's not right. Ask them this, ask them that. And in real time, you would get these messages from them, DMs saying, they're fudging, ask them this. And a constant refrain from them was, and these were people from countries or with a parentage going back to India or Singapore, places like that, saying the public health response in Australia is racist. It doesn't look to those communities and those countries as well as it should. And I think, I don't mean to take us off topic, but that actually was a really big part that ended up informing my coverage in a very powerful way, actually understanding that if you put your lens on too tightly, as you say, Nancy and Tony, for a brand new disease that you know nothing about, your lens is going to stay too tight.
Chinese knew this was airborne at the beginning of the pandemic, and I wish we had listened to them.
You betcha.
So one of the questions that came up, pre-submitted questions, was about maintaining the balance. Virginia, I think you talked a little bit about this, but I think it deserves to be fleshed out a little bit more. So, there's debate with respect to the different vaccines and what vaccines Australia has, et cetera. And there's concern that reporting the debate, even the fact of reporting that there is a debate, may fuel a vaccine hesitancy and decrease uptake. So obviously reporters don't want to cause harm, but you also need to report the facts. So how do you create a balance? How do you try to balance these two potential competing goods?
I think that's one of the hardest things right now. And I think even more so than during the pandemic, I feel acutely right now that the ABC, my program at my station, is not a cheerleader for the government. And if any, new development or vaccine came on the market right now, there would be, who, what, where, when, interrogative questions that we would absolutely be required to ask. And I think actually getting out of my head that this was not coming from an anti-vaxxer point of view, that it was not science skepticism or science cynicism, but just, the straight skeptical questions that need to be asked was a very important part of knowing that I was actually going to do my job correctly. Because none of us here, none of us part of this webinar this evening want to be, looking back in 5 years' time and saying, why didn't we ask this question or that question? I mean, it's all new. So that's a very, very tricky thing to get right. And again, that takes you to some difficult questions that need to be asked. But I think sometimes it comes down to the tone and the manner in which you ask them, which is just, simple, straightforward, trying to get as much information as you can so that you have a listener at home well informed enough that they can go and make their own decision.
Chip, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, look, my bias in this is that I don't think not having the discussion is never the answer. And the reason I say that is because if Virginia's not having a discussion on her program, if we're not reporting it and examining it through the pages of the Age, the discussion is going on anyway. It's going on out there. It's going on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. Or it's just and you push it into the sort of the subterranean elements of the media. You push something to the fringe, and I think that's where it can become dangerous. So a good example is when we had the morning where we woke up to the news that a handful of European countries have put the slows on the AstraZeneca because of concerns that it might be linked to deep vein thrombosis or something of that kind. And Greg Hunt had a press conference that morning, and so the question was obviously asked, and the minister gave a very dismissive response. He says, no, our AstraZeneca is fine, it's no problems, and basically shut it down, didn't want to talk about it. And a part of me thought, well, actually, no, you've actually got to interrogate that, because the more you interrogate it, the more explore, the more you understand why is it that there's this heightened level of confidence here about the vaccine? I mean, that's what you need to reassure people that, yes, it is safe. And in a sense, the greater degree of caution that's being displayed by government decision makers, by the TGA about that, I mean, that should be positive for all of us. Because I agree with Virginia. I think one of the really unfortunate things is that the conflation about concerns about a vaccine that's been developed in record time and the anti-vax movement, which has to do with whether you give your kids a shot for whooping cough. Now, these are really different things, and there is an absolute rational concern to be had about a newly developed vaccine, and that needs to be explored and interrogated and reported responsibly. And I think that's absolutely in the public interest to do that.
Yeah, I think so. And to stay with that example of the initial reports of blood clots. So as a reporter, you get up close to as much information as you possibly can. And so then looking at the research that, which I did, and, we all did, and then you did it in conjunction with you do your work and you try and find, the most credentialed person that you can to speak to that. But in looking closely at the research, what did it show? Well, it actually showed that there was no greater an incidence of that than you would find in the population generally. But what you had was a mass vaccination program. So if you're vaccinating absolutely everybody in Israel or in America, then you're going to come up with, what's the phrase, Tony Blakely, about in the background, the background incidence would be X. And so, you're finding something that's actually substantially less, but it was because you were vaccinating so many people. You can, any newspaper, any broadcaster can pull the headline and say incidence of blood clots, but then, truth and lies and damn statistics, you get close to the information, you get someone to tease that out, and you get something closer to the truth.
So if I can just jump in there, the vaccine hesitancy thing I think is a real concern. So I've actually pulled out of the media in the last month, busy writing research grants, but the other reason was because I'm not really sure how to deal with the vaccine hesitancy issue when you get asked about all this sort of stuff. And I really tripped up on it on Q&A, so I pulled back a little bit. But two things about the vaccine hesitancy, this issue with the venous thrombolisms and the European countries stopping it, it was really unfortunate because it's very hard to get your confidence back up when you've stopped it, and you've stopped it for reasons that aren't really justified. But the other thing I'd say now, so I'm speaking about the institution's responses that are actually driving hesitancy up. The other one that we're learning here is the way that AstraZeneca has done its media communications has been, I was going to say a disaster.
Shocking, shocking.
Okay, all right, let's use the word shocking. Because they've just created confusion. Myself and my good ex-Vice Chancellor of Otago, a good friend of mine, David Skegg, we're having all these emails at the time looking at, because he's an epidemiologist too, and we're going, that's just a chance finding. When they reported the difference when it was a low dose by mistake and a high dose, we're just going, this is nuts. And they're coming out talking about what might be real differences, and sure enough, they're not there. So AstraZeneca has lost a lot of confidence, and they need to rebuild it because it's a good vaccine and we can make a lot of it. At least the other pharmaceutical companies haven't done it quite that badly.
We're going to take a few questions from the audience. I know we have got to this late, but it's been a great discussion so far. Thank you so much. So we'll have Julia Lyons, who is the Vice President of the Melbourne Population and Global Health Students Society, and studying her Master's of Science, specializing in epidemiology. So Julia will be no armchair epidemiologist very soon. She'll be an official epidemiologist soon. And Abby Minter. So Abby joined the Australian Global Health Alliance in June 2020 and is the Deputy Director. She is also a Program Policy and Event Officer for the Pacific Friends of Global Health, a key advocacy partner of the world's most significant global health organizations. So we'll be hearing some questions from the audience now from Abby and Julia.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. So we have a most upvoted question in the Q&A. So when Australia opens our international borders, do you think that Australians are going to be capable of dealing with the reality of living in a world where COVID is present? I think that many would not agree that COVID will be eliminated. Is it responsible to even discuss an end to the pandemic when we are nowhere near it?
Tony, you're taking that one.
This is actually really tricky. So I sense there's two important public discussions coming up. The first one, and Paul Kelly was hinting at this the other day, is that we're going to start changing our dialogue soon to be about not living with zero, but moving towards tolerating some risk. I actually think that's quite a way off. We're doing a launch on Wednesday of these tools we've developed, and I think we don't want to be doing that until most adults are vaccinated before we open up a lot, because things could get a bit ugly. And then we will need to learn to live with the virus to some extent as long as the vaccine coverage is getting up there. So that is a transition that we're going to make.
Great, thanks. Abby?
I have a question for Tony as well, actually. And the question is, expert advice is contradictory at times, but particularly so in a pandemic when we're learning new information every day. So should epidemiological experts debate with each other before going to the public to reduce public fear?
That's a really great question. The answer is yes and no. Sorry to be sitting on the fence here. So I certainly, myself, people like Catherine Bennett, a range of us would get together and occasionally compare notes, but often would be separate. And I think you do need to have some independence. And the one issue that I want to speak to, which I think really discloses some major problems or issues, was, remember when we were talking about whether to keep schools open or close them? And I'd constantly get asked by reporters, should the schools be open, should the schools be closed? And I'd always say, well, it all depends. It depends. If you're going to eliminate, don't open the schools, because the kids will still transfer it. If you're not going for elimination, you're going to live with the virus, then probably keep the schools open because it's part of society you want to value. But we saw, I was consistent in that line, and I believe I was right in the long run. That is pretty much what the literature and the evidence says. But at the same time, we had the peak authorities, particularly federal, who were saying the schools can be open, but ambiguous about what the goal was. I thought that was pretty messy there for a while. But there was a lot of chat, I can reassure everybody, behind the scenes between myself and people who will be unnamed, trying to work our way through that. But it did play out in the public with a little bit more confusion than would probably have been ideal, I think, in retrospect.
I think one of the things you talked to me about, Tony, was about the hegemony of certain opinions. And those opinions weren't always right. So I think that while not having kind of our fights in public makes sense to some degree, there's always the risk that the opinion that would be presented is actually wrong.
Should we talk about the elephant in the room? It's called aerosols. So the peak committee in Australia took a long time to accept that the virus may transfer for aerosols, not just droplets. Now, if we had all towed the line on that expert advice, myself, many other epidemiologists, my good friends and colleagues in New Zealand, we would have not been able to say anything, and it would have been a travesty, because just go look and see what's happened at quarantine. And now all the hotels have been repurposed to have better ventilation because largely of aerosol transmission. So I think it's very important, Abby, and the question, whoever that came from, that you do have people like, not just me, I'm not trying to blow myself up here, but people who are a bit outside. You know, remember right at the beginning, I said I was in an unusual position. I was coming into the country, I wasn't on any committees. I'm a good generalist and I could speak to these issues. I might occasionally be wrong, but at least I could be 90% sure I've been right and actually call it in the public and try and kill some of these myths, if you like.
But I think to your point, Nancy, I think the problems were often created that didn't need to be there because the answers or the approaches were so definitive. It was so definitively put, no, not aerosol, not spread by air. No, kids that young, they just don't transmit it in large enough doses. No, it's just not. And I mean, how anyone could be so confident to be, definitive about bloody anything at the beginning of this now seems to me, extraordinary. I mean, as journalists, we were learning about this in real time. We were learning to pronounce the word epidemiological, in real time, and understanding aerosol research and spread in real time. So, by the time next one comes around, Chip and I will just be, everyone will come to us for answers. We'll know it all. But it was hard, and you guys and the health ministers, plural, and the premier, singular, were being so definitive.
Remember, Virginia too. Of course, we'd get accused of epi shopping. Because, of course, it kind of became like lawyers. Like, if you don't like one opinion from an epidemiologist, we just go to another one, and you can kind of play it that way. So, look, it was a strange thing where the epidemiologists were absolutely the rock stars of the pandemic, and everyone had their favourites. It's almost like you had little kind of footy cards with your favourites on, who you like listening to, and so forth. But I think Tony made a very good point at the start of this whole thing, was that one of the difficulties was very early in the pandemic, where you had the opinions of a lot of our leading experts were almost locked up in commercial and funding agreements with the state and the federal government, and they were very difficult to access in those early months when everyone was really trying to get information for what we're facing, and we understand why those commercial arrangements were in place. And obviously, funding is very important to research, but at the same time, I think the information was more important at that stage, and trying to put that information in the public sphere.
I think you've been too polite, Chip. So as a Kiwi coming in here, the whole funding system here, it's so competitive, and the researchers are so siloed that they need to be on these committees to say their research is having impact, and they become beholden to them and gagged. There's actually a major structural flaw here in the funding that means our experts are not serving society as the taxpayer should expect from a university. I'll stop.
And it's that's likely a topic for another panel. I look forward to reading all of your books, because I'm sure they're going to be very interesting on your experience in the pandemic.
No one's going to want to read a book about this pandemic, but okay.
Oh, I don't know. And I want to very much thank our panelists, David, Virginia, Tony, and Chip, for this very enlightening and lively discussion. Thank you very much for the gift of your time. I want to thank everyone at the Melbourne Student Society and the Global Alliance for helping us put on this panel, for all the viewers for sharing your time with us as well. And I want to put out special thanks to Nathan Grills, who helped contact all of the journalists and used his connections to make sure we had this incredible discussion. So thank you very much. We will be having these regularly, so we'll let you know about the next webinar, and we will also be posting this onto YouTube in the future for your viewing pleasure. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.